Welcome back to the Application Lifecycle Development course. In this lesson, we're going to set up our source code. So let's start back where we were in the Lifecycle project on Azure DevOps. We're going to go to Repos, go to Files. This is where all of our files live. Now, we actually want to work on our local machine, not just in the cloud. So let's go over here to the far right, and you see this clone right here? We want to grab this one, so click it. And it's going to pop open this box with either HTTPS or SSH. We want the HTTPS. So I'm going to hit the copy clone URL to clipboard. I'm not going to open it in Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio itself. I'm just going to do it this way. I want to show you how this process works instead of having a tool kind of do it for you. I kind of prefer to do it myself anyways. So now let's come over here to our folder, and we're going to clone into our temp demos folder. So this is my folder I use just to kind of do some demos. I'm going to create a clone of this code right here. And the way I'll do that is I will open up Git Bash. Now Git Bash is a tool that you're going to get if you have Git, G-I-T, installed. Now, if you don't, let's talk through that. So let's go to a new website, git-scm.com. So git-sourcecontrolmanagement.com. So git-scm. And then in this little TV or computer monitor, actually, there's a button that says download, and it's going to have the latest version for what it detects is your operating system. So as long as this matches, so I'm on Windows, yes. A little bit different, and that's okay. If you want to use a command prompt, that's fine too. It's up to you. Just note that some commands from Windows won't work, from the command prompt, won't work in Bash. So it's a little different. It's up to you how you want to use it. Either one will work as long as you install it so both will work. And that's what I typically do. I like Git Bash because it's got a couple of nice commands, and also because I can just right click, and when Git installs, it adds this Git Bash here to my right-click menu. And it just opens up right there. Now, someone did tell me that if you type CMD and hit enter in this bar, the bar right there, it will open up a command prompt in that window. And that's a really nice helpful tip too. So now that I have my source control, I cloned it. I got a clone URL. I can type git clone and paste in, which is Control V in Git Bash. I can paste in that URL. It's quite large. And no, you can't just copy this and get it from my source control because, again, it's got permissions around it. But that's the URL to my Lifecycle project repository. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to what's called clone, which make a clone of the entire source code repository, including all the commits. So it's going to create a folder in this temp demos called Lifecycle Project, and then put all of my Git files in there. Let's do that. It shouldn't take long because there you go. authentication failed, so I've got to actually set up my authentication for Git. Let's go ahead and do that. So I had to do some work off screen to get my credentials cleaned up. So I had to actually delete my credentials in my computer and restart them in order for it to pop up. Normally it should pop up if it doesn't have credentials and ask you for the login name and password. But in this case it didn't because I had credentials on here. They were just expired. So I cleaned those out. That's probably a source of a blog post at some point. But for today we can move on. It shouldn't be a problem that affects you. So we are in our demos folder. Notice that up here it's empty. So we're going to do our command, which is git clone and the URL, the path to our Git folder. So we hit enter. So I'm going to clone that. Notice it creates the folder lifecycle project, and now we're done. Let me close this out and open up the lifecycle project. And notice there's a couple things we have here. Let's actually zoom in a little bit. That's what I wanted. So as you can see, it's very light here, but there's a hidden, that's why it's light. There's a hidden .git folder, and I have hidden folders or hidden items shown. So you unclick that, it's not going to be shown. But this hidden folder right here is called .git, and that's where all the Git stuff lives. Leave this folder alone. Do not delete it. Do not touch it. Do not change it. Ignore it. That's why it's hidden, because you shouldn't play around with it. But what's in here is everything related to all the different commits and the file states at those commits and basically everything you need for Git. So leave it alone, but that's where it lives. If you wanted to remove source control from this entire project, this entire folder, you would just delete the .git folder. Again, not something you want to do normally, but if you wanted to do it, that's how you do it. Now we have our .gitignore file and we have our readme.md file in this folder, but that's it. So that's where we're starting. So let's go back one level to demos. And I'm going to copy this path here. I'm going to open up Visual Studio and we're going to create our project and we're going to name it Lifecycle Project. So let's create our project. So new project. We're going to web project. It will be a full .NET Framework ASP.NET web application. Now, this isn't as big a deal which one you choose because of the fact that we're not really concentrating on the code per se. We're concentrating on how the code changes flow from we need to do this to it's done and in production. But in this case, I want to use the ASP.NET Web Application Framework .NET Framework because I want to have authentication, which creates a database, and I'm going to create my own database as well, just to make things a little more complicated and make it a little more full of an example of what you do in the real world for this application lifecycle. So we're going to name this after our folder. Our folder is called Lifecycle Project. So let's call this our MVC Lifecycle and Lifecycle Project. We're going to store it in C temp demos. The reason I'm being very careful and name this the same as our folder is because normally it creates a folder and then puts our solution in there and then creates a folder for our project and puts the project in there. But in our case, I wanted to create that folder for the solution right here, which is the same name. So it's just going to put our solution right here. That just makes things a little cleaner instead of having Lifecycle Project and then in here, another folder called Lifecycle Project. When you open that, there's a solution and inside there is the project. And it just makes it, like I said, a little cleaner. So Lifecycle Project is our solution name. Our project name is MVC Lifecycle. It's an ASP.NET web application, the full .NET framework. We hit OK. We're not going to create a new Git repository. Okay, we're going to use Git, but don't check that box. That's for kind of doing it for us. I don't like that. I like to have a little more control over this process so you understand what's going on. All right, in here, I'm going to create an MVC project, and I'm going to add no unit tests yet, but we will add unit tests. I'm going to change the authentication, though, to individual user accounts, which will allow us to create our own accounts, or we can use Facebook, Twitter, Google, whatever. In our case, we're just going to use SQL Server, local SQL Server accounts. We hit OK. So now it says individual user accounts and MVC. Everything else should stay the same. Don't choose any other options. Hit OK. Now let's take a few seconds. As you notice down the lower left-hand corner, it's adding a whole bunch of packages to our solution and making sure that things are set up and prepared for us. But once this gets set up, it's going to create a whole bunch of files in this lifecycle project. Let's open that up. And notice now we have a solution file, and we have our packages folder, and we have our MVC lifecycle folder, and we have a hidden .vs folder. Now, remember, we don't want the .vs folder. We also don't want the packages folder to be committed to our source control. So let's keep an eye on those and make sure they don't get committed. Okay, so this is the start of our project. Notice over here, we see we have these little plus icons. They're very small, little green plus icons next to each item. Actually, let's go ahead and zoom in on there so you can see a little better. So you see these little plus icons? That means it's a new file in Git, meaning we have not yet committed this file to the repository. Now we actually have this Team Explorer tab where you can go and make commits. Notice the changes here, and it's got a list of all the different changes. We're not going to use that yet. We will. But I want to show you first the command line route before we see how easy this really is to use. So there's all of our files, and it's just a basic project. Notice that the web config has an entry for our, once it comes up, it has an entry for the connection strings, the default connection, which is what Entity Framework uses, which right now is pointed to our local DB, and it's got a file name of ASP.NET MVC lifecycle and a long number, and the same thing for the initial catalog. So right now in our Object Explorer, I don't believe we have any SQL servers. Let's just make sure of that. Yep, no SQL servers. So once we run this, it's going to create that for us. That's what Entity Framework does. It creates the tables when we need them and populates them as needed. So that'll give us an example of how to deploy with Entity Framework, which, again, I'm not as big a fan of as Dapper just because of the lack of control, and there's not quite as precise on what I can do with SQL Server. And in my philosophy, I'll be really brief here, my philosophy is that the database should be really performant because of the fact that that's what our entire application is built upon. And so I try and get as much performance as possible out of it. That's why I use Dapper for most of my stuff, if not all of it. But in this case, we're going to use Entity Framework for our authentication because that's what's baked right in. So we'll actually have the ability to see both ways of doing things. So that's really great for our example. Now, real quick, I'm just going to hit the Run button here just so you can see what this application is and how it looks, which is right out of the box. I haven't changed a thing yet. We've just looked at it. So it's going to be pretty basic. But I'm going to commit it at this point. So I just want you to see what it looks like. This is the basic form. Now, just to be clear, it does not create that database that Entity Framework needs for authentication until I use it. So if I register somebody and actually go through the process and register them, or if I try and log in and actually, well, I can't log in because I don't have any credentials. But if I register, then it's going to create that database and then put my information in. So database is not created yet. Now let's go back to our folder. And this is our ctemp demos lifecycle project. That's the folder that we're working inside, and that's where our .git is. That's kind of the root of our project. So I right click and say git bash here. One of the things you notice is it says master here. This is one of those nice features. So it tells me I'm on the master branch right now. And we're going to cover branches a little bit, but for now, just know that master is kind of the default, and that's what most people use as their development branch. So we're going to kind of stick with that. Now, the command line, some people really shy away from the command line because they say, well, we've gone so much further than that. Go back to the 80s because now we have nice user interfaces. And I kind of get that, but for Git, the command line is really powerful and really quick. And it really outstrips almost every user interface. So typically, I use the user interface built into Visual Studio for my basic stuff. But for anything a little more complicated or a little command intensive, I go to the command prompt because it's really easy to remember the commands and it's really quick to do what you want to do. In this case, the number one command you should know is git status. That tells you where you're at with things. In this case, it says we're up to date with origin/master. That's origin is where we got this repository from, as in Azure DevOps, that project up in the cloud. That's what origin is. So this is the master branch. It's up to date with the master branch on origin. And there's actually two things to add: the lifecycle project.sln and the MVC lifecycle folder. Now, obviously, there's more than that inside this folder, but it just gives the top level. Now, and if I wanted to add, I can say git space add space dot. Like so, and that adds everything. But let's see what it looks like in Visual Studio. So Visual Studio, if you want to have a comparable view, there's a comparable view, but it does expand it for us. And notice all the stuff that's getting committed. My encouragement to you is don't just add everything, look through it. Every once in a while you'll find something, you go, oops, I didn't want that added to my repository. It's easier to not add it versus trying to get it out later, especially if it has a password in it, because Git remembers changes. And so you can actually look back at history and see the versions of files as they have progressed. So if you put a password in a file and commit it, and then create another commit that deletes that password, that's great, but they can always roll that file back one and see that password. So getting that password out is a little more complicated. So the easiest thing to do is not commit it in the first place. So let's look through here. And this is our app start folder, that's fine. Our content folder, that's fine as well. Our controllers, sure. Our fonts, we've got them downloaded and that's fine. So we'll leave them there. Our models, our properties, our scripts, which again, this uses some downloaded scripts, but that's because it's specific versions. And that's okay as well. Not the greatest. I'd prefer to have those in NPM, but this is how the template's set up. So we're going to leave it as it is. Our views, we can just expect that all those views should go in. And now we have we're going to come back to web config in just a minute. We have view start, we have our favorite icon or fave icon, and then we have another web config right here, and our two transforms, debug and release. So if you look at one file from this view, the changes view inside Team Explorer, it's going to, if there's a comparison, it's going to give you that comparison. In this case, there is no comparison because of the fact that it's a brand new file. But the one thing I want to point out before you just upload is be careful of your web config file. That's where you typically store certain more secure things like passwords. You don't want those in your repository. So for a connection string, just make sure that it says it's using integrated security or trusted security, just not a username and password. Now there will come a point where we want to use a username and password And we'll cover how to do that in a safe manner where it's not getting committed to your repository. So for now, there's no passwords in here anywhere, so we're safe. So what I'll do is you can go to any root level or any level you want. So if I want to add just app start, I can right click and say stage. I'm going to take everything from app start. But in this case, I'm going to add everything from the whole project. But first, I'm going to hit save all. I haven't changed anything. But this is a good habit to make because if you add a file that you have not yet saved, it won't add those changes that are unsaved. If you hit save, it's going to say, well, that's a different version of that file that you haven't added yet. So just be careful to save first before you add changes. And I'll demonstrate that in a little bit. For right now, I'm going to right click and say stage. Now it seems like nothing's really changed. It just says stage now versus changes. So it's changes and staged changes. What the stage is saying these are the changes I'm going to put together in one commit. And you can separate these out and say, well, I want this piece to go first and this piece to go next. But typically what stage changes are changes that relate to each other. In this case, all the changes relate to each other in the fact that it's the initial template. So I say initial template creation. Now this first line right here is my subject line essentially of my commit. I'm going to hit enter twice to go leave one blank line. And now this line down here is going to start my description or the more full explanation. Try and keep these lines to about 80 characters, maybe a little less. And in fact, don't just use the word wrap here. Try and keep it to about 80 characters and then hit enter. So what I do, I typically move this out a little bit to give me what I assume is around 80 characters. And then when I get near the end, I'll hit enter. So this commit is covering added the ASP.NET MVC template with, now if I type individual, it's just barely long enough. If it's a little shorter, it would wrap, but it'd have a little arrow. Well, it doesn't have a little arrow. So you don't want it to wrap manually. You want to hit enter here. So add the ASP.NET MVC template with individual authentication enabled, and that's probably good enough. And now I can commit my staged. So taking all the files that are in staged, adding this message to them and creating a little bundle out of them. I hit commit, and now they're committed. There's a link right here that says sync to share your changes with the server. Where I click that, but nothing happens yet. It just takes us to a synchronization page. Notice we have one outgoing commit. If I come over here to my git bash and I type git status, now it says your branch is ahead of origin/master by one commit. Use git push to publish your local commits. So I could just hit push to push my commits, but we're not going to yet. First, I want to open up my repository. Notice that my files is still just the 2 files because I have not pushed my changes up here yet. So even though I've changed my file locally, nothing's happened here yet, which I assume you would assume, but I'll be very clear about that. So now I could hit push, but that's not a great pattern to do because if someone else has made changes, you should merge them locally first. So what I typically do is I hit fetch. Now in this case, fetch is going to return nothing. There are no incoming commits. But what fetch does is it just finds out if there are commits. It does not actually bring those commits into my code and merge them. If I hit pull, it will find the commits and merge them. So I hit fetch first to see what commits are there. and what's going to change. And then if I have to, like there's something there, I hit pull, and it's going to merge those changes in. We're going to deal in the future with what happens if you have a merge conflict. But for right now, there is nothing there because we're an individual user. So we should know if there's any commits in the server because we made them. So I'm going to hit push once I've done my pull. So push. And that's going to send just the changes to the server. It's a very light process. It only sends the files and pieces of the file that it needs. Now if we go back here and we hit files again, notice we have our MVC lifecycle and a whole bunch of files in our repository. On our commits, we'll now see that initial template creation. If I click on that, I'll be able to see just what files were added. And there's a lot of them. Now, I also want to point out that you can look at history on something. So, for example, the readme.md. I can look at the history and see, oh, well, I initially added it with this, and then I changed it here. So let's look at this one to compare the current version to this commits version. And it says, okay, we added it at that point. Notice the contribute section. So I can go back and I can look at the history at a different spot. And there's, in this commit, I removed this section. So this history says, this is what it was, this is what it is in this commit. So the red says, well, this was here and you removed it. So really helpful to see that history. But again, remember, if you have a password in here and you had deleted it like we deleted the contribute section, you'd be able to go back and see it. So that's kind of a brief overview of our setup. But now we have code up here. We haven't done anything with builds yet. There's no external server. We haven't set that up yet. We've just set up our initial commit or initial additional commit of code. So we did one where we added just that one template. We're going to add more to our project in a little bit. But for right now, that's good enough. So we've got our template set up. We've got our solution. There we have our couple files. We see those different commits in our project. We're going to stop there for this lesson. The next lesson will come back and we'll set up our project a little more, kind of flesh it out as almost a real project, not really, but we're going to add some more features to it so we can make it a little harder when it comes to creating our pipelines, just so we have a more full example. And we'll also get to kind of get used to this commit and push cycle. Okay? So come back for the next lesson.